All right, so now we are in the education portion for the millennial generation. Trained for a world that was already gone. Millennials were the first generation educated almost entirely inside a promise that collapsed in real time. They were told education was protection, it became leverage. They were promised mobility, they received debt. They were trained for compliance, memorization, and credential accumulation in an economy that would soon reward adaptability, emotional intelligence, systems thinking, and self direction without updating the institutions responsible for preparing them. Education did not fail suddenly. It was slowly hollowed out between the late 1980s and the 2008 financial collapse. Then its costs were transferred directly onto students. Millennials did not opt into this experiment, they were raised inside of it. The generation that held the absence. Generation X absorbed the collapse of boomer structures without receiving replacement maps. Cynical, adaptive, and self reliant, they modeled survival without repair. Millennials inherited this emotional restraint and institutional distrust, but without Gen X's insulation from economic precarity. Gen X functioned as a silent bridge, holding families, workplaces, and systems together while meaning eroded. Their sacrifice was not loud, but it was foundational to the terrain millennials were forced to navigate consciously. The core difference: Gen X experienced educational collapse as a disillusionment, millennials experienced it as a developmental programming. That single distinction changes everything. Timing, collapse versus conditioning. Gen X 65 through 1980 entered school before full standardization. Experienced creativity, electives, shop class, art, and music. Collapse happened during adolescence or early adulthood. They remember education working differently. Impact: this system is broken. Millennials 1981 through 96 entered school after standardization had already begun. No memory of a non metric system. Collapse happened before identity consolidation. The system didn't break, it was normal. Impact: this is reality. Something must be wrong with me. Key distinction: Gen X saw betrayal and millennials internalized failure. Standardization introduced versus totalized. Gen X testing was introduced gradually. Teachers still had autonomy. Creative intelligence was still visible. Nonlinear thinkers could survive. Millennials, standardization testing was the environment. No child left behind defined the ecosystem. Teachers were constrained, not guiding. Divergence was penalized from early childhood. Historical shift. Gen X encountered metrics. Millennials were raised inside metrics. College optional path versus mandatory funnel. Gen X college was encouraged, not compulsory. Trades and alternatives still socially valid. Tuition was high but survivable. Debt existed but wasn't identity defining. Millennials, college framed as non negotiable. Trades socially erased. Student debt normalized and moralized. No degree equals no future messaging was relentless. Difference: Gen X chose college, millennials were channeled into it. Technology introduction versus cognitive shaping. Gen X learned without the internet. Technology arrived after core cognition formed. Could separate real life from digital life. Skepticism was optional. Millennials learned during the transition. Cognitive developed alongside early internet. Cognition developed. Forced to self educate as institutions lagged. Skepticism became necessary for survival. Difference: Gen X adapted to information overload, millennials were formed inside it. Failure location: external versus internal. Gen X, when education failed, blamed went outward. Cynicism developed, humor became armor, and identity stayed relatively intact. Millennials, when education failed, blame went inward. Anxiety and shame replaced cynicism. Identity formation was interrupted. I did everything right became a wound. Translation: Gen X said the system is bullshit, and Millennials said, why isn't this working for me? Emotional outcome: cynicism versus grief. Gen X educational imprint: distrust, sarcasm, low expectations, and emotional distance from institutions. Millennial education imprint: grief, moral injury, identity collapse, loss of future orientation, and obsessive self correction. Millennials didn't just lose faith, they lost trajectory. Bottom line: if Gen X education is about disillusionment, millennial education is about identity fracture. If Gen X says don't trust the system, millennials say I have to rebuild myself outside it. That's the historical difference, and that's what makes millennial this millennial chapter an animal on its own. All right, so 1988 through 1996, the promise phase, education as the new social contract. Millennials entered school during the final years when education was still widely framed as the primary solution to equality and instability. Historical context: late Cold War optimism, post civil rights expansion of public schooling, residual post war belief in upward mobility, and early neoliberal policy shifts not yet visible to families. Core messages absorbed in childhood: college equals stability, degrees equals safety, teachers equals authority, and the institutions are the benevolent gatekeepers. This was reinforced by parents educated in a cheaper, more stable system, guidance counselors using pre 1980s labor data, and media narratives framing education as moral responsibility. In elementary school, authority still felt parental, rules felt protective, achievement felt meaningful, but the economic and institutional foundations supporting this model were already eroding beneath the surface. 94 through 2000, standardization takes hold. Metrics replace meaning. The mid to late 1990s marked a decisive shift towards measurement driven education. Key developments: expansion of state level standardized testing, federal pressure to quantify performance, curriculum increasingly aligned to test outcomes, and reduction of exploratory, creative, and unstructured learning. What changed inside classrooms? Teaching shifted from inquiry to output, curiosity became inefficient, divergence became a liability, and obedience was rewarded more consistently than insight. Students learned early the goal is not understanding, it's the correct answer. This phase trained anxiety driven achievement, perfectionism, fear of intellectual risk, and external validation dependence. Curiosity did not disappear, it was suppressed, delayed, and privatized. 2001 through 2010. No Child Left Behind: accountability without infrastructure. In 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act restructured American education at every level. What NCLB claimed to do: improve educational outcomes, close achievement gaps, increase accountability, and standardize quality. What it actually produced: funding tied to test performance, punishment of under resourced schools, defunding of arts, humanities, and electives, teachers teaching to survive, not to inspire. Schools became bureaucratic survival systems, discipline first environments, and psychologically unsafe for divergence or failure. Students learn not to ask the wrong questions, not to stand out too much, and not to challenge authority prematurely. Education increasingly trained risk aversion, not intelligence. 1998 through 2008, the college push and debt normalization. Education becomes financialized. By the late 1990s, millennials were aggressively funneled towards higher education, regardless of economic reality. Key shifts: tuition rises far outpaced inflation, student loans reframed as good debt, degrees mass produced, credential value diluted, and career pipelines quietly collapsed. Education stopped being primarily about learning and became a financial instrument. Students were told this is the cost of entry, but no one disclosed wage stagnation, credential saturation, shrinking labor protections, unpaid internships replacing jobs, delayed economic independence. College no longer functioned as a ladder, it functioned as a toll booth. 2000 through 2010, technology enters education without wisdom. Millennials were the bridge generation, education largely in analog systems and graduating into a digital economy. Key features: computers introduced without episiotomy, internet access without media literacy, tools without ethical framing, and information without discernment training. Students learned how to use technology, not how technology shapes cognition, how to access information, not how truth is constructed or manipulated. This produced information overload, early institutional skepticism, do your own research culture, and distrust of official filters. If this were millennials, this is where millennials learned if I want the truth, I have to find it myself. 2008 through 2012, the collapse moment, doing everything right and still failing. The 2008 financial crisis hit millennials at the exact moment education had promised payoff. They had followed instructions, studied, complied, borrowed, and waited, and the system failed to meet them. The emotional fallout: grief without language, shame for systemic failure, identity collapse post graduation, delayed adulthood milestones, and resentment towards institutions that never acknowledged error. Education had not prepared them for reality, it had prepared them for disillusionment. The millennial educational imprint, what the system taught them. Millennials learned early and repeatedly that authority can be wrong, credentials do not equal competence, systems protect themselves first, intelligence is often inconvenient, healing and integration are not institutional priorities. This is why millennials distrust experts without lived experience, research obsessively, cross reference everything, resist indoctrination, and build knowledge horizontally instead of hierarchically. They are not anti education, they are post illusion. Millennials were not undereducated. They were miseducated for a world that no longer existed, and then forced to re educate themselves while carrying the debt. All right, so that was a very short video compared to the other ones, and I am going to cap this off and go into religion and morality.